Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Jack Hagel. The November election is now less than 2 months away, and we're getting a clearer picture of where voters stand in this battleground state. Results from a new WRAL News Poll are rolling out this week, offering insight into North Carolina preferences when it comes to candidates in top races and key issues such as abortion and the economy. WRAL State Government reporter Will Doran joins us for a quick breakdown. Will, good to see you again.
Thanks. Always fun to talk politics.
Now, the general election is looming. The latest WRAL News Poll is out. What is the big picture takeaway so far?
Well, the poll overall was pretty good news for Democrats, and there were, a few different reasons for that. But in general, it looks like it's kind of on the backs of women voters in particular are going more and more towards Democratic candidates as we get further in the election cycle here. And that's obviously due to a number of factors, but, in each question we asked, in each race we polled, that was one trend that kind of stayed true throughout the whole thing to different extents for different candidates and different issues. But in general, you saw, men being slightly more pro-Republican and women being a lot more pro-Democrat.
Well, let's dig into the races. Let's start with the governor's race. What do the latest figures show in that race between Republican Mark Robinson and Democrat Josh Stein?
This was a massive, massive result for Stein's campaign. He is up by 14 points over Mark Robinson. And, we had, as you mentioned, reported, that Robinson has been lagging in some of the polls recently. And we had heard pushback from Robinson's campaign that, the polls in North Carolina don't always get the governor's race right. Oftentimes, they said, in the past few elections, the Republican candidate has actually done maybe 5, 6, 7 points better on election day than the polls actually showed. Well, this is a 14-point lead for Josh Stein. No candidate for governor has done 14 points better than the poll showed. So I think the Stein campaign is probably going to be pretty pleased about this poll. The Robinson campaign, maybe not so much.
Now, that's a big difference from what we had in March. It was a single-digit lead for Josh Stein. How did he gain votes?
There were a lot of people who were undecided in March, and a lot less of them undecided now, and almost all of those undecided voters have broken for Stein. You've seen, in rural North Carolina, for example, we're a very rural state. The rural vote is important here. I mentioned women earlier. Donald Trump is leading Kamala Harris by 10 points among rural women. Josh Stein is leading Mark Robinson by 10 points among rural women. So that's a 20-point gap. 1/5 of women in the rural part of the state are potentially Donald Trump and Josh Stein voters, those split ticket voters that you see. Obviously Stein has been just hammering Robinson on abortion in particular, which was another issue that we pulled on in these findings. But that has really been a key issue in that race for governor. And the numbers were not great for the Mark Robinson campaign here.
Now, we also polled on the presidential race. What did we learn from that?
Much closer than the race for governor. While we found the 14-point lead for Josh Stein in that gubernatorial race, there was only a 3-point lead for Kamala Harris over Donald Trump in the race for president here in North Carolina. And that was well within the 5-point credibility interval that we have. That's basically a margin of error for this poll. And so you could definitely say it's a statistical tie, but the edge kind of goes to Harris right now. These polls are obviously just a snapshot in time. This was taken before that debate between the two candidates. Some people could still be making up their minds. The poll found that there were about 5% of North Carolinians who were still undecided in the presidential race. So some people might hear that number and be shocked. Say, this is the third time in a row that Donald Trump is running for president. How are you still undecided on whether or not you're going to support him? But we've found that consistently, that there's about that 5% of voters. And guess what? Here in 2016, Donald Trump won the state by about 4.5% of the vote. In 2020, he won it by about 1.5% of the vote. So those 5% of people who are out there who are still undecided, they are key voters who could decide how this state goes, and North Carolina, frankly, could decide how the presidency goes.
And they could also have some effect on further down ballot races. And we gauge some voter preferences on those, things like state superintendent and attorney general. Anything there?
Yeah, those were interesting. They more or less reflect the presidential results. They don't really reflect the results for governor, even though these are all, people who run the executive branch of government, the superintendent of public education, the attorney general, the governor. They all sit together on the Council of State. But voters in those races are really taking their cues less so from who they like for governor and more so from who they like for president. And it's also interesting because, Democrats have really tried hard, especially in those two races we've mentioned for attorney general and for public instruction, to tie the Republican candidates kind of to Mark Robinson and say, look, they're all extreme in the same kind of way as Mark Robinson is. And this poll kind of indicates that hasn't really worked for the Democrats. The messaging just hasn't gotten through to voters. And we talked to, some experts who watched this, and they said, there's been so many ads for president on TV, so many ads for governor on TV, that these other candidates, even though they might have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in the bank, just have not been able to get in front of voters and put their message out there and say, this is what I believe in, or this is what my opponent's about. So everyone is just kind of viewing these candidates as just a generic Democrat, a generic Republican. They don't really know that much about these races. So, if that describes you, if you don't really know much about these races, we've got about 2 months left. We're going to be reporting on it plenty here at WRAL. Now's the time to go ahead and get educated.
Well, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll hear more results from the WRAL News Poll, and we'll also get an update on Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s legal battle with state elections officials. Stick around. Welcome back to the WRAL Daily Download. We're talking with WRAL State Government reporter Will Doran about the latest results from the WRAL News Poll. Will, we also polled on some hot-button issues. One was of particular interest this week with action at the legislature on private school vouchers. What did we learn from that?
Yeah, so the legislature is back in session on Wednesday. They are planning to finalize this plan to expand funding for private school vouchers. And the poll found that most North Carolinians don't approve of that plan. It was a bit split. There's a decent number who do support expanded funding, decent number who say they definitely oppose it, and then also a decent number of people who just haven't really made up their mind on the issue yet. But there's no solid consensus that this is what we should be doing as a state. That's not stopping the legislature. They are moving ahead full steam. This is a key issue for Republican politicians and Republican political donors, and they want to get it done. They tried and failed during the short session this spring to get a budget together. It broke down largely because of disagreements over how much money should we give to these private school vouchers versus how much money should we put into raises for state employees, raises for teachers, other priorities, and they just couldn't come to a deal. Now they have decided to focus in on these private school vouchers with some other things thrown in, like they're adding an immigration bill onto it as well, which obviously is right before the election. Immigration is a key issue for Republicans, so we kind of get this grab bag here at the legislature.
And we also did some polling on abortion. What did the poll show?
Yeah, so we asked the exact same question back in March, and then now 6 months later here, telling people, okay, here in North Carolina, the legislature recently changed the abortion laws, making them stricter to cut it off after 12 weeks of pregnancy. What would you think about a plan to make that even stricter and make it after 6 weeks? And what we found here, and this was actually a little counterintuitive, was that there were increasing numbers of people who said that they would be okay with a stricter abortion ban right now. So maybe that could be we're just getting a little bit further away from that really heated political discussion of a year ago when we first passed this law, or what we heard from some people, that political scientists that we ran this question by, it's possible that some people were just confused. It's really hard with abortion to really nail down the details. Voters often have, ideas of how they feel about abortion, but when you start asking the specifics, it can get a little hard to nail down some of the numbers. And so it appears, at least now, that people are getting a little bit more conservative on the abortion issue. But at the same time, the poll found that Democrats were doing pretty well. So we're going to have to keep an eye out on those findings. And maybe this is the start of a trend, or who knows how else we can interpret that.
And that's been a pretty key theme in the governor's race, right?
Yes, yes. I mean, the very first TV ad that Josh Stein put out was about abortion, and notably didn't feature Josh Stein talking at all. It only featured comments of Mark Robinson's on abortion and women who get abortions, and it really seems to have swayed a lot of voters against Robinson and towards Stein. But Robinson supports this 6-week ban that we polled about that appears to be gaining some popularity. So maybe it's that people don't necessarily mind what you say, it's just how you say it.
Now, one of the biggest issues in the presidential race is the economy. How are North Carolinians feeling, and what could that mean for Harris or for Trump?
So people are still not unanimously happy about the economy, but overall people are a little bit more optimistic than they are pessimistic. And going back to our poll 6 months ago in March, comparing those numbers, people are getting more optimistic. So that can really only be good for Harris, I think. Republicans have really tried tying her to Joe Biden and Joe Biden's administration. And obviously Biden has just, taken a lot of heat for rising inflation from Republican politicians and from voters all across the aisle. I mean, inflation doesn't just hit Republicans. It hits Democrats and unaffiliateds and libertarians just like it does anybody else. And so the big question has always been, would Republicans really be able to tie Harris to inflation and those concerns that people are feeling over that, or would she be able to, put forward her own policies, kind of separate herself from Biden's legacy on economic issues? And what we saw on this was that there is a large tie between people's political views and how they say that they feel about the economy. So, I think, some of it is based in reality. How is the economy doing for people? But also there is a tendency for Republicans to say that they're a little bit more pessimistic, and Democrats say that they're a little bit more optimistic. But in general, feelings of optimism are increasing. And as Harris, not the real incumbent, but essentially the incumbent, tied to the incumbent, that can only be a good sign for her.
Now, switching gears, I want to talk about a closely watched legal battle involving the presidential election. Now, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was trying to get on the North Carolina ballot, and Democrats were trying to keep him off. Then he wanted off, and a Democratic board said he should stay on. Now, the state's highest court has had the final say. Walk us through all of that.
Yeah, this whole thing has been just a mess over the last 2 months. I mean, we could do a whole podcast series on it if we wanted to. Twists and turns all over the place. First, Kennedy wanted on the ballot, then he wanted off. But what happened recently was he did say he was dropping out of the presidential race and endorsing Donald Trump. Then, fearing that if he stayed on the ballot in North Carolina, he would take votes away from Trump and then hurt the cause of the guy that he just endorsed, he asked the State Board of Elections, hey, will y'all please take my name off the ballot? The problem was, by the time that his party actually got around to making that request to the State Board, they had already started printing all of our ballots for this year. And that's because he dropped out in late August, and the state's legally mandated deadline to start sending out mail-in ballots was in early September. And so there wasn't time. They had already started printing these ballots, and they said, sorry, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., it is too late. We have to just get these ballots out, otherwise we'll be violating the law. And so they went ahead and decided to start sending out these ballots with his name on them, even though he had dropped out. So he sued, and he lost at trial, but then he won at the Court of Appeals. So the State Board of Elections appealed that to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court also ruled in favor of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. So the main takeaway from all of this is, one, we're going to redo all the ballots without his name on them. And two, the start of mail-in voting is now getting pushed back potentially by up to a month here in North Carolina. Now, like I said, there are still 2 months until the election, so people will still have about a month to receive their ballot from the state, think about who they want to vote for, fill it out, send it back in. There is still going to be time if you want to vote for mail, but it's a lot less time than there had been in the past. And so Democrats are concerned that this could primarily hurt them, because if you look at the numbers, Republicans, because of everything that Donald Trump has had to say about mail-in voting, Republicans don't really vote by mail anymore. They used to be a huge factor in mail-in voting because it's mostly for rural voters. But now, especially since the pandemic, Democrats are much more likely to vote by mail. So there's a fear among the Democrats that any sort of issues, wonkiness with mail-in voting, now that it has been pushed back, we don't know yet exactly when they will be able to start sending ballots, but it sounds like 3 to 4 weeks could primarily hurt Democratic voters.
Going to be interesting to see how it all plays out. Thanks, Will.
Thank you.
That's WRAL State Government reporter Will Doran. For all of our coverage of the WRAL News Poll, go to the NC Capital section of WRAL.com. We'll be putting out new poll results throughout the week. I'm Jack Hagel. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for listening to the WRAL Daily Download and for making us part of your morning routine. Another great way to get WRAL news is the Morning Briefing newsletter. It's a daily email with Triangle news, events, and headlines to help you get ready for the day. Sign up at WRAL.com/newsletter.